Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James, and I'll be chairing today. So these are our speakers today, scattered around the southern part of the UK. So Ian, I'm afraid, is in lockdown in Wales, and I'll just briefly introduce them. So Dr. Nadine Williams is the author of the book we're talking about today, Ishikawa Sanshirō's Geographical Imagination. So she is the main speaker, and she is a lecturer at the University of East Anglia, specializing in intellectual and cultural history of Japan. And she has published translations of Sarashina Genzo's poetry, and also has another book on the way about Japanese perceptions of the far north, Japanese poets' perceptions of the far north. So our second speaker is Dr. Constance Bantman. She is a senior lecturer in French at the University of Surrey, and she is an expert on French anarchists, including their activities in London. She's published this book about French anarchists in London, and also a biography of the writer and editor Jean Grave. I assume that's how it's pronounced. And then Dr. Ian Rapley is a lecturer in East Asian history at Cardiff University, and he also is a specialist in the intellectual and cultural history of Japan. And I'm pleased to say he's a former Daiwa scholar, having gone out on our program in 1999. And his book is about the history of Esperanto in Japan, which sounds fascinating. So this is the timeline. That was my introduction. We'll have about 15 minutes presentation from Dr. Nadine Williams on her book, 5 minutes or so comments from each of the other two, and then there'll be a little bit of discussion between the three of them before we open it up for questions for around 20 minutes, or it might run a bit beyond 1 o'clock. So over to you, Nadine.
All right, I'm going to share my screen first. Right, that works, I think. Hello, everybody, and thank you, of course, to the Daiwa Foundation and to Jason James for giving me the opportunity to present my book. Thank you to Constance Bantman, whose research overlaps with mine in such an interesting way. Thanks also to Ian Rapley, who is like me, a historian of modern Japan, but whose life of Seiko Udoku, which is plowing the fields when the weather is clear and studying when it rains, Ishikawa Sanshirō would certainly have approved of. He was a believer in self-sufficiency. And thank you to the wonderful audience today. So let me first clarify what this book is about. Ishikawa Sanshirō's Geographical Imagination. Well, it's a biographical study of anarchist Ishikawa Sanshirō. He was born in 1876, died in 1956. And my focus is really on the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And the book is also in intellectual history because it captures through Ishikawa Sanshirō and the cast of characters that surrounded him, the ferment of ideas that were at work in this exciting and turbulent period of Japanese history. So the book does not define anarchism or even Japanese anarchism. My question is really, what did anarchism mean for Ishikawa Sanshirō, this journalist, political dissenter, a thinker, an activist, and a traveler? And so in the process, I highlight the tensions inherent to Japan's process of modernization and sketch a strand of political dissent that has largely been overlooked until recently. You may ask, why did I choose Ishikawa Sanshirō? Well, to me, he is simply endearing. Well, he's endearing because he was on the side of the underdog, and not only in a purely ideological way, but I thought he was genuinely on the side of the underdog. He was also endearing because he was intellectually very curious. He learned French fluently. He could speak some English. His interest stretched to not only political thought, but to natural and social sciences, religion, literature. He knew, of course, his Chinese classics, but also his Japanese traditions, of course. He studied French political thought, avant-garde theater, English literature. He was interested in Greek philosophy. So he was really broad-minded. He was also endearing, and I think that's very important because he was much more than an abstract thinker. He was a doer. He was suspicious of political agitation for its own sake and determined to implement in daily life his brand of non-violent anarchism. And for example, he worked in the south of France as an agricultural laborer for a while. He also founded a very small anarchist commune back in Japan in the 1920s. So lastly, I found him relevant to today's world because of the ecological preoccupations that run through his socio-political vision. He saw a balanced human-nature relationship as essential for a fair and fruitful organization of society. So in this book, in order to write this book, I traced Ishikawa's steps from the early years of his activism in 1903 to the war years. And I paid attention to his travels, to the people he met, the books he read, the thoughts he had, and the activism with which he engaged. So in the first period of his life as an activist, between 1903 and 1913, he was close to socialist dissenters gathered around the figure of well-known Kotoku Shusui. He joined the non-war movement against the Russo-Japanese War, in opposition to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. And he was also closely involved in the pollution campaign led by Japan's first conservationist, Tanaka Shozo. Now you can see him, I don't know whether I can show, but Ishikawa is sitting on the right at the feet of Tanaka Shozo, who holds a stick. And the Diashio copper mine pollution incident was the first major environmental disaster of this era of modernization. It went on for over 2 decades. It devastated fields and livelihoods and eradicated a village of over 1,000 households. And I found it useful to distinguish about this period between 2 strands of Meiji era socialism, one geared towards urban conditions on the one hand and rural concerns on the other hand. And Ishikawa was definitely engaged with the latter. In 1913, Ishikawa left Japan on a self-imposed exile to Europe. And the reason was that the tightening repression by the authorities after the high treason incident a couple of years earlier created some danger for him. His close friend Kotoku was one of those executed, and Ishikawa had the grim experience of retrieving the body of Kotoku from the jail after execution. But in fact, his escape was kind of dramatic too, because no sooner had he set himself up in Brussels that the German army invaded Belgium, leaving death and fear again in its wake. So I go to the next slide. Nevertheless, Ishikawa made important contacts in Europe. In England, he met social philosopher Edward Carpenter, and through mutual acquaintances, he also met Paul Reclus, who you can see here on the left with his wife, Marguerite. Paul Reclus was the nephew and professional heir of famed anarchist and geographer Élisée Reclus. And with the Reclus family, Ishikawa lived in Brussels, and then for several years in Dôme, a small village in the southwest of France, which I had the happiness of visiting, including the little house where Ishikawa stayed for about almost 5 years. As you can see, it's a beautiful place. Élisée Reclus had been a pioneering geographer during the second half of the 19th century, although largely ignored after his death in 1905, until more recently. And he left a large body of work. Here is Élisée Reclus. He left a large body of work, including L'Homme et la Terre, Man and the Earth, a 6-volume compendium in which he expanded his vision of social, what he called social geography, which was in fact his view of human geography, and which struck a chord with Ishikawa. Now, reclusion geography stressed a two-way dynamic interaction between man and nature, as well as the interconnectedness of Earth's phenomena. And in the tradition of 19th century anarchism, Reclus also saw in nature lessons to apply to the organization of human communities. And the very broad scope in both time and space that this geography covered and the humanist perspective that sustained his work were at odds with the conventional geography and the prevailing ideologies of racial hierarchy and nature subjugation of the time. Returning to Japan in 1920, Ishikawa developed his own brand of anarchism, both in theory and practice. And again, I followed his track when he toured Japan to talk to tenant farmers who were struggling in an increasingly oppressive system dominated by landowners. In 1925, Ishikawa set up with other like-minded activists a network of self-governing farmers' councils. The scheme folded after 2.5 years as call for farmers' independence and dignity were increasingly silenced by the appeal of more strident left-wing and right-wing ideological movements. So Ishikawa settled in the suburbs of Tokyo, cultivating a small piece of land and striving to lead a life of self-sufficiency. But he worked tirelessly from then on the translation into Japanese of Reclus' L'Homme et la Terre. And he set up a small publishing outfit and produced for several years a slim periodical called Dynamiku, La Dynamique in French. And you can see on the right-hand side that he was very much into these transnational exchanges of knowledge. There's a quote by Proudhon, the early French anarchist. So he published Dynamique, and that particular periodical discussed his own ideas and propagated the view of recluse geography and anarchism. And he remained for the rest of his life in contact with many anarchist sympathizers that he had met with over the years or corresponded with. And I made this very rough sketch of the kind of contacts that you could see that were taking place through Ishikawa. I put him in the center, of course, but including in the process, when he was in the process of translating Reclus' geography, Reclus' L'Homme et la Terre, he was in touch with some anarchist of Romanian origin in New Jersey. He was, of course, in touch with Edward Carpenter, with Max Nettlau in Vienna. There was also a group of anarchist sympathizers in Hokkaido who had read his translation of Reclus. So it was quite of an interesting movement of ideas. And I put also all the kind of press or periodicals that all these people were contributing to. Right, so let me go back then to the title of the book and the notion of geographical imagination. Now, it refers to a model of social organization that opposed what Ishikawa perceived as the dogma of the times. And it valued human agency over faith in mechanical development and linear progress. It valued cooperation and mutual aid over competition. It valued self-sufficiency and independence over capitalist exploitation, and it privileged attention to the man-nature relationship rather than over-exploitation of the natural environment. So Marxism in history and historiography has obscured this strand of thought. As I also show in the book, however, the rehabilitation of human dimension in science, and hence in all aspects of lived experience, had been debated in Japan during the Meiji period by amateur geographers and others. And so ideas were picked up by Ishikawa precisely because they corresponded to a vibrant homegrown tradition. The dialogue with European radicals such as the Reclus family and Edward Carpenter reinforced and validated this tradition. So to conclude, Ishikawa's vision had its contradictions, ideological ambiguities, and a good dose of utopian naivety. But his brand of anarchism was a non-violent, a quietist form of progress, and it sought to implement social change and regeneration through the practices of daily life based on cooperation and mindful of mankind's relationship to the earth. Ishikawa kept going, faithful to his principles in the face of adversity, and without ever falling either for Japanese ultra-nationalism or Soviet totalitarianism. And that I found inspiring. That's it for me right now.
That's right. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Daiwa Foundation for hosting this wonderful event. Nadine, thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this. We've never managed to meet in person, but what better way to meet than to launch and discuss your wonderful book. And I'll start with this just by saying this is a fantastic book. I strongly recommend reading it. This was my privilege to read it for this event. It's obviously splendidly researched, and that's the first aspect I'd like you to comment on in your responses about the research process. You know, the covering Ishikawa's career. He was obviously hugely prolific and polyvalent in his multiple endeavors. I know he was a very prolific writer as well. He traveled extensively. So these French-British connections, ending up in a house in the south of France. Could you tell us a bit more about the research process and the sort of piecing together of these transnational peregrinations? I'd be very curious to hear more about this. Another aspect which I really enjoyed is how beautifully you write. I think you really do convey such a sense of time passing by, of epochal change when needed, and also of place. And of course, this notion of place, when you're writing about grassroots geographers and individuals concerned with the land, with the environment, it's absolutely crucial. It also has those academic connections with the growing trend for social space theory, which you hint at in the book. So it all fits together beautifully in a very vivid and very compelling and academically sound narrative. So that's a fantastic book from this perspective. I think your publisher, by the way, did a fantastic job. It's a really nice academic book as well. So I learned a lot while reading it. I learned a lot about anarchists and geography. Of course, I think many outside observers or even academic scholars of anarchism are interested in this connection between anarchism and geography, and you really delve into it. And it's absolutely fascinating because you do explore the ideological connection, but again, how it really played out in everyday practices. So absolutely fantastic from this perspective. I think it's a major contribution to the study of anarchism as a transnational movement on various counts. So first of all, it's the way it allows, well, me as a scholar of European anarchism, French anarchism, to become so immersed in the history of Japanese anarchism. And there is a lot of talk at the moment about provincializing Europe, decentering perspectives, and I think you do this really effectively. I know this is something you're interested in. I've seen it in your other publications, but this idea that anarchism should be approached as a more horizontal movement, and that there should be an emphasis on mutual interactions. And I think you do make this case very effectively. And one case in point is when you write about the Manifesto of the 16, which is this landmark document in the history of French and Western anarchism, the document which ripped asunder the movement for decades, when a number of signatories, including Ishikawa, voiced their support for war intervention with the Entente powers in 1916. And in Ishikawa's life, it doesn't seem to be the landmark seismic moment it was in the Western movement. So there's almost, well, it would be a flippant to say comedy aspect to this, but it's such a powerful example of decentering. The second aspect is how, as part of this whole idea of decolonizing anarchism, you redefine anarchism as a different set of practices. The interplay of similarity and difference with Western anarchism is so striking because there are so many similarities, the broader context of nationalization of the nation state, asserting its power in a context of intense industrial capitalism, sort of encroaching gradually, and all the movements of resistance, the way anarchism touched on educationalism, and the way it drew in intellectuals, geographers, academics, alongside the working classes. I think you show that that the specificity of anarchism in Japan in a very compelling way. And actually, one question I had in connection to this pertains specifically to this makeup, the specificity of Japanese anarchism. So as I've mentioned to you in our previous exchanges, I think one of the great aspects of the book is that it's actually a very peaceful read. So yeah, I know this sounds a bit Orientalist, and that's not the intention, but I think this is due in part to the fact that Ishikawa himself was really interested in spirituality, in Buddhism, Taoism, in environmentalism. And it's a sharp contrast with the history of Western anarchism, where violence, repression, propaganda by the deed was such catalyst for the movement. So I'm really interested in this contrast, and I was wondering whether this is something you've approached deliberately, if it's a choice on your part, if it's a reflection of Ishikawa's specific brand of anarchism, which you've obviously discussed in your presentation, a difference which defines Japanese anarchism, but obviously there's a lot of violence in Japanese anarchism and a lot of repression as well, from the copper mine disaster to the high treason to the background of multiple wars. So I was wondering if you could expand on this in your response. And finally, another aspect that you have mentioned, and which I know features prominently in your work, is the importance of emotion, emotional ties, friendship, and serendipity in ideological choices. And I think that's something we both agree on. Your introduction has really shown the many reasons why Ishikawa is such an endearing figure for you. And you've mentioned this term. You do mention his ambiguities as well. And I imagine that researching this book, you spent a lot of time with Ishikawa and many of his partners, fellow anarchists, and I'm sure when you look at photos of Reclus or other anarchists, you feel like you're looking at an old friend. So I was wondering whether you could talk about your own emotional bonds with your subject of research and how you approach their activism from this perspective. And that's what I will finish with.
So yeah, thanks Nadine for the invitation to comment on this book. And I just thought I'd start off by saying how much I both enjoyed it, but also how much I got out of the book, and those two things don't necessarily go hand in hand. just to sort of, for context, Nadine and I were doctoral students together. So I've seen this project developing over time. I guess you never know quite where you're going to go when you start a research project. You don't know where it's going to take you. And I think perhaps it's a promising sign that you yourself can be changed by the research you do. My most vivid memory is when Nadine came back from a conference, I think it was on geography, and she was sort of brimming with energy at the sort of the ideas that have been thrown out about this sort of networking she'd been doing and discussing with these other geographers. And I think that energy and that vitality is something that really comes through in the book itself. From my perspective as a historian of Japan, I agree with Constance. I think this is a real addition to how we understand Japanese intellectual history. It's very easy to talk about overcoming the East-West paradigm or overcoming stereotypes of sort of East-West relationships. But it's a harder thing to really substantiate, I think. Likewise, sort of when it comes to transnational history, it's something it's easy to aim for, and lots of us are trying to write transnational histories, but it's something that's perhaps harder to really achieve. And I think this book really does both. It's very good at at showing how Ishikawa was not a recipient of European ideas. He was a partner with his European collaborators, and the way that his thought blended influences that he found wherever he found them. And it shows also to the extent, the real extent to which he was a global actor rather than just a Japanese actor. The history of the left in Japan, particularly in this sort of early 20th century, can be a little bit dry, I think. There's a lot of theory and there's quite a lot of organizational structure and reforms and so on in some of the texts. And so this book really comes alive. It really shows us sort of the heterodox thinking involved, but also how those ideas could be lived, could be put into practice. And I think that is sort of the dimension that really comes forward that perhaps I haven't really sort of appreciated in some of my other reading on various parts of the Japanese left. And I think this idea of geography, of that relationship between human geography and nature is a really productive one. Just to add my questions to the pile, I'm also interested in where we go with this idea of anarchism in the wake of this book. We have ideas of sort of urban versus rural thinking. We have violence and non-violence. We have Christianity as an entry point, but often leading to atheism. We have Kropotkin, we have Marx, of course, but we also have Buddhism being most notably, as I think you've pointed out, we have theorists, but we also have activists. That is to say, not necessarily political activists, but sort of people putting their theory into practice, practitioners maybe even better. So, that's something I'm interested in. I'm also interested in taking that a little bit further. These figures have concern for the common man, the commoners, the farmers, and so on. But many of them have very elite educations, and it's not always clear that to extent to which they actually know what the farmers are doing. So Ishikawa seems rather better than most, but I'm interested in that connection between these sort of elite thinkers and yet the commoners with whom they were so engaged. So that's sort of one big baggy question about the nature of anarchism. And then secondly, I've just come away from teaching my first years some historiography, and E.H. Carr says, history is a dynamic interplay between the past and the present, between the historian and, in his case, he writes his, but his or her sources. And so perhaps it's a bit of a cliche at a book launch like this, but it really does feel like this is a timely time to be writing this topic. So I thought that's my other question, is what it means and perhaps you'd just like to talk a little bit about what it is to be reading and writing about someone like Ishikawa in the 21st century. Okay? And I'll leave it there. But thank you again.
Great. So back to you then, Nadine. And then we have a bit of a free-for-all, perhaps, between the three of you for a while. But so do feel free to chip in the other two.
Right. Well, I think these are wonderful comments, not only because they are very complimentary, but because they illuminate even further what I tried to do. So thank you. I'm very thankful for those. I'm going to try to answer some of these questions. I don't think I can answer everything in detail, but let's go first with the sources. Well, as I said in my presentation, I really tried to look at Ishikawa and to see who he was meeting, what he was reading, what he was thinking, and what he was engaging him in. And that meant that I couldn't really be happy with the published works. So I went through all the little things that also make up the life of someone like him. Of course, his correspondence in French, in English, in Japanese, private correspondence that they have archives. I also traced, or tried as much as I could trace the correspondence he had with all these other anarchists. And then I looked at their own comments about Ishikawa. Edward Carpenter, for example, has in his memoirs made some comments about Ishikawa. I was also very lucky to look at anarchist papers at I think it was Harvard University, and I looked at all the Japanese name, and wonderful, one of these names that appears is the one that had talked in his letter about Élisée Reclus. So you see, sometimes luck is involved, but I really tried also to go to the kind of, travels, to try to understand the kind of travels, both physically and both in his mind that he did, and how it would define his thought. So that was the first question. Now, I know we've Constance has talked about also emotional investment, and I think one of the reviewers for the book said this is it's a manifesto. So I was a bit tense because as a historian, you're not supposed to write manifestos, but I think that when you write a biography, or in this case, because I went through this correspondence and all his personal diaries and memoirs, you enter into the mind of a character to some extent. And I came to see through Ishikawa's eyes, and what I saw predominantly was really his his distress at seeing Japan's mindset at the time, which according to him was governed by social Darwinism, these ideas of linear progress, mechanical development, that would completely devalue individuals in their everyday lives and actions. And it was really something that upset him and that he wanted to work against. And I think in a sense he was visionary, because other following events showed that there was indeed something uncontrollable in that kind of process. So yes, there is an emotional investment, although I'm very much aware of all the what should I say, the ambiguities, the ideological blurs that he made several times. I mean, he was on the side of farmers, but he was skirting with popular agrarianism at one point. He was, during the manifesto of the 16, he signed that manifesto, but yes, of course, this really goes against the principles of anarchism, where you don't take sides for a capitalist country. Well, he did, and this was his own emotional investment because he was with Paul Reclus there, and that is what he did. So there is some kind of emotional investment, but I think it really means how did he see it, and why did it make so much? Why was it so important for him to fight certain trends or certain mindset in Japan at the time? Now, I know that both Constance and Ian have talked about the way the diffusionism of anarchism and how we can somehow try to decenter. So I'm going to try to respond to this. If I find my notes. Yes, what I tried to do is to show really how much for Ishikawa, anarchism at the time had so many roots in Japanese tradition, Japanese history, and Japanese traditions themselves. And what he did really is he corresponded with all these different people, and he read an enormous amount, and he really tried to identify the commonalities that therefore validated his own ideas and anarchism as he saw it in Japan. And I give you a couple of examples. One is, of course, this similarity that it's, of course, very broad, but the similarity that you can see in this with Buddhism and, you know, Reclusian geography that values the interconnectedness of all natural phenomena. And of course, this idea of interconnectedness, even from a very broad sense, is present in Buddhism. And Ishikawa, in all his writings, he came up several times with these similarities and Buddhist vocabulary. He was using a Buddhist vocabulary. The other thing that is quite interesting, and I think that is highlighted by his correspondence with Edward Carpenter, is the idea of spirituality, that, you know, the regeneration of the social order is something very gradual, and that spirituality is part of the political engagement. And so both Edward Carpenter and Ishikawa were convinced that violence was not the answer, the first answer. Destruction could not be an answer to a good future, you know, a good social order, that these changes had to come gradually, and that self-cultivation, spiritual sort of enlightenment was part of the process. Now, what we think about this now is, of course, different from what they were thinking at the time. And interwar Japan, of course, was very much permeated by this notion of spiritual forces and what they call Shinpi-shugi, you know, the mystical, or the whatever was not necessarily rational. And I think that's really part of the understanding, how we can understand that period in Japanese history. Now, I was also intrigued with Ian's comment about, well, I could agree with this idea that there's a discrepancy between the view of the elite and the view of the commoners. And I think that Ishikawa saw that, I mean, I had to face that obstacle too, is that even though he was on the side of the underdog and he was trying to do his best to propose a form of social organization that would benefit these underdog, or the more common people, he was not always recognized for his efforts by these same people. And I think it happened to many of these elite intellectuals who were touring the country and lecturing these farmers, for example. And there's a passage in the book where I explained that one of these farmers said, you know, we plow the land for survival and we can't stop. Actually, we're not in a position to stop. And it's very well to be lectured about all these things, but in the end, what we want is a complete change of the system. And that particular character went back to a left-wing class consciousness-based movement that could indeed change completely their status. And so, yes, there was some kind of misunderstandings between the two sides. And finally, oh no, there are a couple. How much time do I have?
Well, we can keep going. We've got 1 or 2 questions coming in on the chat. Well, I have a question. Maybe our other 2 speakers have more questions.
Well, I think that I'm just going to end with the relevance. I mean, the relevance is, of course, in this idea of ecological concerns that really runs through Ishikawa's work and the people who were surrounded him. It was a core concern. He was involved in this anti-pollution campaign, and his interest in human geography. It was really to show how an investigation of human geography was a way to understand the world and therefore to make a better world. And I think that's important. And the other aspect, which I find very relevant today, is of course this idea that a big government is not necessarily very welcome. And that development of Ishikawa's life took place when Japan had, as we know, modernized, and that meant centralization, bureaucratization, which in his eyes took too much space. And it was really devaluing the individual talents, the individual strength and dignity. And that had to be countered. And I think that the relevance is very clear from that point of view too, that aspect.
Right, okay. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. We've gone past 1 o'clock. And it just remains for me to say thank you very much indeed to all three of you, obviously particularly to Nadine for writing the book. And it sounds great. I hope I can get hold of a copy, but I'm sure I can get hold of a copy and read it in due course. And thank you also very much to Ian and Constance for taking part and for your very useful comments. So, bye for today.